Welcome to Vibrational Revelations. I'm Elena.
I am Alejandro.
And today's episode is on Scotland's hidden sacred past with the one and only Freddy Silva. Freddy Silva is the best-selling author, leading researcher of ancient civilizations, restricted history, sacred sites, and their interaction with consciousness. He has published 7 books in 6 languages. I don't know if that's changed now to more books, and produced 13 documentaries, described as perhaps the best metaphysical speaker in the world right now. For 2 decades, he has been an international keynote speaker and leads personal sellout tours to sacred sites worldwide.
God, I'm exhausted just listening to that.
For me, it's exciting. I want to go to one of your tours.
That's what I've been doing for 30 years.
So how, Freddie, first of all, it's such an honor for us to have you here with us, our
Thanks
community.
for having me.
Yes, it's so excited to
Sorry that looks sunburned. It's just that I have lighting because it's absolutely pouring down with rain here.
You're in
I look kind of red, but that's not actually how I look. So I apologize for that.
Yeah, so let's begin. You know, I do have a million questions for you. So we'll just start wherever you want to start, and then we'll just go from there. But I guess the biggest question I have is for you. Who built the monolithic culture? Where do you think?
God. Well, in fact, we were just talking about that last night on another show.
Oh, really?
And you have to go back about 12,000 years to get an answer to this. And you have to listen to what the indigenous people were saying and are still saying, which is that we hunter-gatherers lived side by side with a more advanced group of humanoids who looked just like us. But to quote them, they were human, but not quite human. It's a great phrase. And they were much taller. Whether you're in the Pacific or Yucatan or the Middle East, they call them, they're very tall people with lighter skin than the average person. Blonde, blue eyes, or red head and green eyes, which is very unusual when you hear that in the Pacific. And everybody got along just fine. It wasn't a sort of a hierarchy. It was just the fact that some people were more advanced than the others, but everybody got along just fine. And they called them by different names. They lived on different islands around the world. As far as I can figure out, when I was researching the material for the missing lands, I kind of located about 8 islands where they lived, which are now gone for the most part. And they called them the Shining Ones, or the people of Anu, also called the Anunnaki. The followers of Horus, the people of the serpent, which is like a title of office, but they're all connected by the same function and purpose, and that they were described as having the ability to move things according to the laws of nature. So they knew how to work nature and bend the rules within the rules themselves, to the point where they would move the stones to a sound or a musical instrument, or the command of the voice. And according to the local traditions, which are worldwide, they claim that these places were built literally overnight. So when you go to a place like Tiwanaku or say Giza, and you look at the scale of these monuments, and you think, wow, that was built overnight. But when you hear the story repeated again and again and again around the world, you begin to realize that these are eyewitness accounts. They're not just mythology or folklore, which is a good point in which to start any observation. But they appear to be speaking from direct experience and observation. And that's what's amazing about this story.
Beautiful. So is that how you started on this journey? Because I know we're talking about Scotland today, but I'm so curious.
It's all connected.
It's all connected. But what is it that led you into studying sacred sites and ancient civilizations?
I was drawing pyramids when I was 3. I didn't really belong. I didn't really have many friends when I was growing up. I was just considered to be different. And I followed my own path. And I always had this feel for very ancient things. I still do. And I've always felt that the truth that we were told was never quite, it didn't ring a bell. You know, it's like we go to school, we hear these stories, and the whole thing that aliens built everything also didn't resonate with me. I believe in aliens. I know it's a very complicated universe, but I don't think that they were involved either. And I just kind of followed that trail. It's just, it took me a long while to get there. While I got things out of my system. You know, you go into industry, you become, you know, I went into advertising and I was a creative director and a successful one. And you know, you're going to making lots of money, and then you realize one day that you're doing the wrong thing. And you got a lot of money in the bank, but you're miserable. So I just had to take a leap of faith and give up my entire life and follow my heart and do what I believe to be right. And I haven't stopped doing this for 25 years. I'm still on tour after 25 years. And by the way, I just released the 14th documentary last night. So on the Maya, the origin of the Maya. So yeah, it's a passion. I think we're all born with something, and if you're lucky, you'll discover your passion early in life. And you know, some people find it later in life. As long as you find it, that's the most important thing. So I found it a little bit sort of in between my life, and now I'm making up for lost time, which is there's no plans for me to retire anytime soon.
That's great. We all get to benefit from your explorations and wisdom. And it's so
Yeah, I'll
interesting.
either be killed by death or mummification or both. I don't know.
We actually just revealed a month ago frequencies of the Mayan civilization. So that would be interesting. Maybe another discussion that we could have.
Oh, it's a very interesting thing. Yeah, well, yeah, it's just like we were saying before. I mean, the Maya show up out of nowhere in 3000 BC with this complete civilization. Well, that doesn't happen unless there's a blueprint for the civilization. And yes, the people that founded the Maya were also part of this global culture of what we call gods, people who have a complete understanding of the laws of nature and how to bend the rules. So there's another culture before the Maya, and they're very interesting. And by the way, Maya is not really a people, it's a way of thinking. So if you adopt this way of spiritual belief, you become Maya. You're not born as a Maya. And that comes from the spiritual teachers. It's not my opinion. It actually comes from them.
So the gods, what you reference as gods, are those the same beings as you've referenced humanoids? Or they're
Pretty much.
Pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, you have to understand that our concept of God in the Western world comes from religion, and specifically Catholicism, that there's a white guy with a beard that's a very unpleasant person. He doesn't have a sense of humor. He likes killing people and destroying things. It's like, well, how did this guy become the head of a religion? I mean, it's not going to end well. You know, if they had Gandhi as the head, that might actually work, you know, or Robin Williams, that really would work. But no, a god essentially is a force of nature. So for example, this glass of water has its own god. It's a spirit form that envelops the water and the glass and the silicate that makes the glass. Now, if I come to understand how the glass is made and the value of how the water can be shaped by the interaction with my intent and the body of the water, I have understood the relationship and I become as a god. So this has a god and I have become as a god because I understand it. And that's how it developed. But then it gets distorted into some hierarchical invisible being that we all have to bend down and worship. We've got it completely wrong in the West.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So before we dive into Scotland, do you feel, well, I know that you do, but humanity has been seated here by these humanoids? Or would you say that we are an experiment that happened on Earth?
I think there's two sides to the story because it really depends on how you read the original accounts, most of which came from Sumeria. But the Sumerians inherited their information from the Armenian people. This is something that very few people know about. And there's a connection to Scotland about this as well. There's two sides of the story. One is that there was a global flood about 11,000 years ago. And most people died, but also, and I'm quoting the Egyptians, the divine inhabitants of these islands also died. There were a few survivors. Now, these were the gods, and they're the ones that kickstarted civilization. They helped us out of this terrible situation. And then, because there weren't many of them left, and they looked different to us, they tried to intermarry with human women. It didn't work out very well because these people were 8.5 feet tall, and the women were giving birth to infants, so they died during childbirth. So they had a bit of a problem. Now, if you look at the Sumerian tablets, they talk about a time when there was a kind of experimentation going on with the black-headed people. Now, you'd only write about black-headed people if there are other people to compare them with, which goes back to the blonde people and the red-haired people. And those were considered to be the godlike people. So there appears to be some kind of genetic manipulation that was going on to get the gods to breed with humans successfully to maintain this bloodline, because it's about survival, isn't it? And there was a time during the Egyptian story where they talk about a half human, half divine bloodline governing the throne of Egypt. And that lasted for about 5,000 years before the Egyptians said, the first ruler, and I quote, of a purely human bloodline takes the throne of Egypt in 3000 BC. So obviously they succeeded in this intermarriage. So there's two sides to the story here. There is an experimentation, but there's also a parallel culture as well.
Who was the first human ruler of Egypt?
Mena.
Mena.
Yeah, you may have stayed, when you go to Egypt and you stay at Mena House, the hotel next to the pyramids, it's named after him.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
And then there were, so from the floods, right? Or did it happen before that there were 7 different types of civilizations that came up?
I found out that there was, they were living, all these gods were living on their own communes in islands or places that behaved like islands. And one of them was Lake Titicaca, which back then was a huge inland ocean. So the city of Tiwanaku was one of those islands. It was surrounded by water. It's still there, but the lake has now disappeared 15 miles upstream. There were other islands like the one in the middle of the Atlantic, which is called Atoll, according to the people who first arrived in Yucatan. There was Kashkara, which is where the Hopi came from in the Pacific. There was Kainga Nui Nui, which is between Easter Island and South America. And there's a whole bunch of other ones without a name. They call them the birthplace of the gods and so forth. But most of them have now disappeared. And one of them used to be where the Arabian desert is now. That's where there used to be one of the islands where the Anunnaki used to live. And that story comes from the wisdom keeper from an island in the Cook Islands in the middle of the Pacific. The last place where you expect to hear the word Anunnaki in the Pacific, they talk about this missing land in the middle of what is now the Arabian Peninsula. And they said, well, back then, the Earth was subjected to such a stress because of the meteorites that were falling out of the sky and creating enormous tidal waves. The Earth went through so much stress that we cannot compare what we see today with the land that was there before. And it's something that geologists have a hard time sort of accepting, because they think that the Earth moves slowly. Everything is very gradual. No, if you go to New Zealand and you happen to have been in New Zealand 5 years ago, there was an earthquake which lasted 30 seconds. They gained 2 meters of land. I'm not talking that way. The land literally rose 2 meters. So people came out in the morning and they found a complete, extended coastline. That happened in 30 seconds, and that was a small earthquake. So these things have a habit of changing the world very, very quickly. So yeah, these gods, they seem to have lived in places that were aside or set aside from human beings. They didn't want to hang out with us. I think they recognized that because they were different and more advanced, they didn't want to interfere in our development as hunter-gatherers. They would give out the information slowly, a little bit by bit, much like if we go into the Amazon and we're wearing watches and cell phones and cameras. Well, if you go to the Amazon and there's people there that have never met people who got clothes, for example, you're going to negatively impact the development of that culture. So you have to do it slowly, methodically, and let the people develop at their own speed. And that makes a lot of sense, even today, as it did 11,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I'm also curious because you often reference, I know you probably want to ask a question.
Hello,
I feel like I know his thought of
the observer in listening, learning.
He's channeling.
He's channeling to me and I'm asking you a question.
It makes you more powerful.
Well,
that's right. You've got it together.
The power is in the silence, right?
Yes, it's all in here.
So the question that I have, because I know in several of your episodes, I think in many, you often reference the belt of Orion. And for people who are not familiar with belt of Orion, I wanted to bring that out because there is absolutely a significance with how a lot of these sacred sites have been built.
Yeah.
And perhaps you can dive a little bit into that connection.
Yeah, it's a world connection. And I had no idea it was that prevalent. And the idea goes back to the concept that thousands and probably tens of thousands of years ago, because indigenous people don't keep time like we do. For them, the time is circular. It just keeps going like this in a big spiral. They don't really care about time per se. It's about the journey. That's the most important thing. So they talk about a time a long time ago where the original humanoids and the gods all came from Orion, from the belt stars of Orion. It's as though it's a big junction box in the sky where things go to, and then from there you go somewhere else. And they're very specific about the three belt stars, that the gods not only originated from there, life originated from that location, and also humans at one point also came from there as well. And they speak of this as if it's completely matter of fact. Now, when one person says it, you think, okay, it's a good imagination. When everybody says it, now you realize that they're talking about something that they've experienced. And they were saying that there's a moment in time where people could physically travel backwards and forwards to the Earth, to the belt stars of Orion. And sometimes they would take a lucky human with them to see how things really work. And then they'd bring back the human, and the hunter-gatherer would go to his tribe and say, guess where I've been this weekend? And I know a better way of doing things. And that's how they did it, by example. So I'm now quoting the different stories that I've heard around the world. And then they said, at one point, they began to lose that connection for various reasons. So they stopped flying from A to B. They built structures like pyramids to imitate the physics necessary to get you physically from A to B. So if you've been in the King's Chamber and you've gone into that box inside that building, you know that box is very dangerous, and people have died in there, because leaving is easy. Coming back is the problem. You need to know how to come back. So I always tell people, don't go in the box unless you know what you're doing. So they built these places to keep that physical communication going. Thousands of years later, they're saying, well, even that connection became very tenuous. So they began to communicate shamanically to the belt stars of Orion, and they could take their presence there, and they could be there physically, even though they're still on Earth as well. And now they just communicate with the spirit forms in Orion through the shamans in each culture. Now, to maintain that connection, people from Japan all the way through Egypt built their structures to mimic the belt stars. So, you know, Egypt is the classic one. The three pyramids, they mimic the belt stars of Orion on the on the equinox of 10,400 BC. Göbekli Tepe, 800 miles away, has exactly the same alignment and exactly the same date. In Scotland, in 5,300 BC, I just found 3 stone circles at the very northern tip of the archipelago called Orkney, which is a beautiful place. 3 beautiful stone circles, which also have 2 big stone circles and 1 little one, slightly offset, just like the belt stars of Orion. And it allowed me to create this alignment to a natural bowl that they're looking into on the horizon, out of which comes the belt stars on the winter solstice in 5,300 BC. And the stone circles are a mirror image in reverse of the belt star that they're looking at. So we can go all around the world and look at this connection to the point where if you go to Japan, and we're familiar with the Torii arch, those big red arches that they have in Japan at the entrance to the sacred sites with the big red crossbar. That crossbar represents the belt stars of Orion. And the crossbars are the 2 posts of wisdom. And in the center, it represents the heart of the sky, which in terms of physics is the nebula, M42, which exists at the center of Orion. And if you tell this story to the Maya, they'll say, well, yes, that's called the heart of the sky. That's where we all come from. That's where life comes from. Now, fast forward to today. NASA has just revealed that M42, the Crab Nebula in the middle of Orion, is the biggest star-forming region in the galaxy that we know of. So we've just validated tens of thousands of years of indigenous thinking. So there's more to this story than just looking up at this constellation in the sky and thinking, hey, that's a pretty cool thing. I think I'll honor it. No, there's more to it. There's a much deeper story behind this.
Yeah, amazing. It makes me think of, for example, people who are able to, we hear stories of time travel and bring information back. somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, who was supposedly missing for a few years, disappeared in the forest, right?
He didn't know how to come back.
Came back with all these like futuristic things, right, that he supposedly channeled. And it's fascinating because on the consciousness scale, 1,000 being the highest, he actually had his creativity at the frequency of 1,000.
Yeah.
So he was able to channel or to connect, to perceive without any resistance, whatever information was given to him. So would you say he probably did the time traveling or figured out how to do it?
Oh, it's probably shaman. It's to do with shamanism. I mean, he was part of a group of people who essentially was a mysteries group, and they came from a very long tradition of mystery groups that held this information in secret. Because if you understand the laws of nature, you can bend them for right action or wrong action. They didn't just give this information out without you developing a sense of integrity. And then, and only after 3 years would you be told the rules of how to do this out-of-body journey. So this is a story that goes back to Japan in 8000 BC to something called the 17 Ways of Ise. So how Isis becomes a goddess in Japan is another story. But this concept called the way eventually becomes Taiyi, which means the way. Or the Tao, as we call it in the West, and eventually it becomes the same mechanism by which the Essenes and Jesus Christ learned their secrets of leaving the body and coming back with information. They call it the living resurrection because you don't actually physically die. You go out of body, you go into another world, you retain the information that you get, you bring it back after 3 days of being out of the body. So you're technically dead for all intents and purposes. But your spirit has actually left the body, it's gone traveling, gone walkabout, it's recovered information, and it knows exactly how to maintain that information when it comes back into the conscious world. That's a very difficult thing to do, and it's very dangerous. And that's what Jesus was good at. And that's what thousands of people before him had been doing all along. So Da Vinci, and I think Isaac Newton also alluded to the fact he'd gone through the same technique too, because you couldn't say this in medieval Europe. You'd have your head chopped off or you get burnt alive. So they had to keep very quiet about this. So the Rosicrucians and the White Brotherhood, the Brotherhood of Light, the Invisible College, these were all variations of the same thing. The Knights Templar were also the same variation of the Essenes and so forth. The Druids were part of that technique as well. So all of these people are having these near-death experiences deliberately induced in order to leave the body physically and extract information and come back and apply the information for the betterment of humanity. But again, it sounds great fun, and it is. And I've kind of inadvertently had an experience of this several times in my life. And I can say it's very addictive, and I'd like to do it again. But the fact is, it's so nice when you've left the body and you're in this other world. You don't want to come back.
Yeah.
The problem is you've come here with a mission. You have to complete the job. Otherwise, everybody would just be killing themselves and going, I've had enough of this. I'm leaving. I'm going home. Yeah, but it would defeat the purpose of why you're here anyway. So there is a reason behind all of this.
So now it brings us to Scotland.
Oh, yes.
Share the connection of Knights Templar, Druids, Essenes, and how it's all connected also to Scotland.
Well, I mean, you have to go back to the story that we began the conversation, which was the gods. So we go back to ancient Armenia, and you think, what the hell does Armenia have to do with Scotland? I didn't make the connection for years until I discovered Armenian language. And language is a great fingerprint. It tells you exactly how people move, and it shows how the language develops, and it also shows how the ancient naming of places and things describes what they are. Today we go up to Scotland and say, I think I should go to the stone circle of Callanish without realizing what the word means. And of course you're going, what is this place for? Why did they build it? Well, look at the origin of the name. And that tells you everything you need to know. That's the beauty of this. So 10,000 years ago, we have the people of Anu, the Anunnaki, living in the Armenian highlands. And eventually they move out north and south. They go to Sumeria to form the Sumerian culture. And then in the north, they form this massive civilization called the Scythian civilization. It extends from the Russian steppes through Siberia, all the way around the Black Sea, all the way to Bulgaria, Romania, and the north of Greece. Huge piece of land. And these people call themselves the Tuatha De Danann, So the language has already changed. You've gone from Anunnaki to Tuwa the Danu. Well, by the time they get to Ireland and Scotland, they're called the Tuwa the Danan. So you can see how the naming changes. And there was a big migration in Central Europe in about 6000 BC. The weather was terrible. Trying to grow crops was a really hard problem. So these people that were maintaining the old traditions of the gods had to move. And some of them went south. They went into the Mediterranean. These are the red-headed, green-eyed people with the elongated skulls, by the way. And they traveled through Malta. They settled in Sardinia, of all places, where I think it's something like 80% of the people there still have elongated skulls. It's incredible. And they have an Armenian DNA to match. So those people eventually go around Spain. They go to Portugal. They found the oldest city in Europe, which is Braga in Portugal, which is an Armenian name, by the way. They settle in the Basque country, which is an Armenian enclave. They go to Karnak in France, which is an Armenian area. And they eventually create Wales and the divine bloodline of Ireland. The next group are the interesting ones. They're the blonde, blue-eyed, light-skinned people that form the Scandinavian culture. And they go up to Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and they go around England and Scotland, and they settle on the islands. So that's pretty much the connection. They went all the way around in 5300 BC, and they settled the islands of Orkney, the Isles of Lewis around Scotland, and then they created what they had already established before in the Mediterranean. All the stone circles, the strange round towers, the big passage mounds with the horns at the front, all of these things are not indigenous to Britain. They come from somewhere else. So they're extending their civilization in order to keep the momentum of the knowledge going. Because again, we're fighting climate change. The people are trying to grow crops in terrible conditions, and they're fighting for land. So we're going back into a kind of animalistic nature. That's not going to evolve anybody. These people were astronomers. They were great magicians of the land. They knew how to work nature. And the idea was to reestablish what they had already built where they came from, so that they could restart another civilization on the extreme part of Europe. That's what makes Scotland so interesting. We have this megalithic culture that comes out of nowhere, complete mystery how it appears there. But if you follow the trail back to Sardinia and Armenia, all the origins of what we see in Scotland are still there today.
Fascinating.
Like, how do you find these places to, like, does somebody call you and say, Freddie, I have these.
Actually, what you're doing is not very different to what these gods were doing, which is you're curious, and two, you understand nature, you listen to nature. A lot of what I do, and I didn't realize I was doing it for a long, long time, I tap into the land. I'm very conscious of the world around me. I'm very in tune with nature, with animals. Humans I find difficult, I have to say. I think we all do sometimes. But I listen. I listen a lot to nature, and I didn't realize it for a long time that my grandmother had the same ability. She was very intuitive, and I didn't give it any credit until I realized when I started writing, most of my information comes from being on the land and listening to what the temples are telling me. And I'm writing notes, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm so clever. I'm writing this down, but where did it come from? How do I validate all this stuff? Well, that's the hard part. Libraries, research, books, talking to indigenous people, getting the mythology, the folklore, and slowly you build up the information that then gives, you goes into writing a book or designing a documentary. And then you give people credence that what you've built is built on a solid foundation of work that can be validated, and it can be validated. But the hard part is you have to spend years and years looking for this stuff, literally digging under the surface, going to strange libraries and finding unusual books, and it's all there. That's the hard part. But the easy part is just walking on the land and thinking, now, what is this place all about? And don't expect anything in return. If you expect a return, you'll get nothing. It's like being a child. You walk in, and I remember going up to Orkney and going into one of my favorite stone circles. There's only 3 stones left of 11, but my God, those 3 are mind-blowing. They're 19 and a half feet tall. They look like they were built by a machinist. They're about this thick, 19 and a half feet tall. They stand on a center of gravity, and they're very pointed, very angled. And you stand there in this incredible landscape with 3 other stone circles going along this hill. and you feel like you're part of a big machine, and you can feel people talking to you. They're all around you all the time, and you start making observations. So I was in the stone circle at Stennis, and I thought, I feel like I'm inside a kind of a place of council. I can't explain it any other way. I feel like among council members, and people here are doing talking, and they're looking at the stars as well, but it's a place of thinking where very tall people used to be. Well, I wrote this down as an observation. I dug up the history of Orkney, and from what the Scandinavians wrote, they said exactly the same thing. This stone circle of Stennis was considered for many thousands of years to have been a place of council. So I've already channeled the land into the research, and I can validate it because someone else wrote about it too. Now, looking at the word Stennis, where does it come from? No one has any idea. So this is when I started learning Egyptian and Armenian, and I began to break the word down, and it exists in both languages. And in both Egypt and Armenia, it means the place of council. And it literally is Stennis. So the word has changed a little bit from its origin, but it still sounds the same. So you see how it works. It becomes a sort of a relationship with the spirit of place, and then they give you the information, and then you go away and work with it. That's how it works. It's real magic, but I have to say it's bloody hard work.
Yeah, I'm sure you're like the deep investigator. So you actually answered my question just now by saying you're studying. You are totally chilling. You're both are.
We're going to do this very quietly after the next hour.
Yes. How many languages do you actually speak is what I want to know, because I'm sure language comes in handy, right, when you're doing the research.
Oh, very much so. Well, we're dealing with dead languages here for the most part. I speak Portuguese. I was born in Portugal. A little bit of French, which I try to practice as much as possible. I have dreams of marrying Marion Cotillard, the most incredible actress in the universe. Yeah. Beautiful woman. Unfortunately, she's now married, so there's my dream gone. So I've been practicing my French. English, which is my second language, which is actually my first language. But wherever I go, I always try to be polite. I always try to learn at least 30 polite words. So in Egypt, every time I go, which is twice a year, I pick up a few more words every year to the point where I can now make the odd joke in Arabic. And after a while, you develop an ear for the language, and you begin to get into it for your research. Armenia is the same thing. I just wanted to find out from, in fact, it's a very funny story. When I was writing Scotland's Hidden Sacred Past, I wanted to get more into the Armenian language, and someone gave me a copy of a book about the origins of Basque language, which is something I've been fascinated with for a long, long time, by an Armenian academic called Vahan Setiam, who have now become really good friends because his book helped me write the book about Scotland, because I was able to figure out all the words in Scotland and Ireland of all the sacred sites, even the names of the islands. They all have a root in Armenian, and they tell you exactly what you're looking at. So you're not just making it up, you're actually looking at the very phrase that's written down. So it's a matter of just, I know about 15 different languages, but bits of them, the things that are very important. For example, Aymara, which is one of the oldest languages in the world from South America, and specifically around Lake Titicaca. And he helped me to understand what was going on around Tiwanaku and around the sacred sites of Bolivia and the Andes. And it's thanks to my guide, who is an Aymara, and there's not many of them left. There's only like 8,000 people. I kept asking him, does this name mean something? So Tiwanaku, he says, yes, it means the place of my shining people. And says, well, do you realize you've just described the gods of Egypt? I did, yes. So we have these wonderful exchanges that they don't know the history of the other side of the world, but I do. So I'm filling in the gap in their understanding, and they're telling me what their language means. So yeah, I speak 15 half languages, but it gets me where I need to go.
Wonderful.
The other thing I noticed is you have somewhat of a grasp of constellations. Are you into astrology too, or no?
I am, but not in. I'm not an expert by any length, but I have to try and take an interest. Well, the work that I do is multidisciplinary. I'm not a particular expert on anything, but I know a lot about many things. That's the important thing. And then I draw on the expertise of people who really know what they're doing to bring focus into my work. So that's how you basically collate these strange stories together. I have been surrounded by people who are very, very good about astronomy. And one of them was Gerald Hawkins, the man who wrote the book on Stonehenge, helps decipher what the crop circles are all about using mathematics. So he taught me a lot about the sky. And in terms of astrology, I've also had two of my best friends, which have now passed away, were two of the greatest astrologers I've ever met as well. And it's all about learning the interaction between the sky and who we are as people. And I had no idea that there was that intimate connection, which is why we go back to the earlier question, that the temples in Scotland and in Egypt and in Armenia, they're all mirroring the constellations on the ground. There's one in Sardinia, for example, which is tied to Scotland as well, where there's a whole collection in the valley of temples, which are a mirror image of the Pleiades. I mean, literally, you take the Pleiades in 6000 BC as they looked above Sardinia, reverse it, and there are all the temples exactly as they should be. So yeah, I am very cognizant that there's a relationship between what happens in the sky and how it influences our lives down here. The Egyptians said it very well, you know, as above, so below. Everything is a reflection of everything else. So it pays attention to have a multidisciplinary look at all of these things in order for you to be able to understand what the ancients were up to.
Yes, because I do remember you mentioning the Cygnus, the swan constellation, and how it's also linked to Knights Templars and the ancient feminine.
That's interesting. Of course, I have to kill you if I told you. Well, I mean, Cygnus comes in much later in terms of the Templars, very, very late into their story, when they changed their name into Scottish Rite Freemasonry and Rosicrucians. These are the same people, but in order to survive the church, they had to change their name. It's the best public relations joke ever played in history. The church thinks that they've killed the Templars, they just changed their name. It's like they got a new business card. Very funny. They developed the sign of the swan as being the constellation of grace. So a swan, when you look at a swan, it's a state of grace. Now, how does that translate as a metaphor? A person who understands the mysteries teachings and embodies those teachings and is illuminated, there's a certain grace about these people. You know, they're upright, and there's a certain debonair, there's a certain shine, a glow about them. So hence the name Shining Ones that they used to give to the old gods. There's a shine about them. So when you see the saints, they have a halo around them. So it became, it typified a secret symbol to people who wanted to communicate without being killed, that if you build places or they're aligned to Cygnus, this is a place where you should be paying attention to. There was one episode on, I think it's on, is it Ancient Aliens? No, it's the History Channel, about Oak Island and the fact that the Templars had a treasure there off the coast of Canada. It's absolute nonsense. There's not a shred of evidence behind it. But if you look at the boulders, there's a lot of white boulders there which are aligned in the shape of the constellation of Cygnus. So I suspect that the Rosicrucians might have been off the coast of Canada, which would have been the right period of time. And I said, they're digging in the wrong place. The big shaft that they're digging up and blowing up, that's just getting your eye away from the prize, because they never would have been that obvious. Follow the neck of the boulders and you'll go to a cove on the back of the island. And I bet you that's where the original entrance was. And guess what? 4 episodes later, someone actually mentioned that as though my house is bugged. And they actually went there and looked for it. They drained the bay and there's the entrance to the actual site, which is now, of course, underwater. They'll never find it. But 12,000 years before that, the Egyptians were already into that. And they called it, the Swan constellation was actually the constellation of the Hawk. And it was associated with Isis. And one of the earliest associations between what we call Cygnus and the constellation of the Hawk was that the Osirian in Abydos, which is one of the oldest temples in Egypt. And let's see, from my calculations, in 10,500 BC, if you were standing in the Osirian, which is now an underground temple because of the mud from the Nile that's built up around it, before it was just sitting on the Nile. If you were sitting inside the Osirian looking at the front door, looking across the Nile, you would have seen the Milky Way rising after sunset like a vertical river. So it's incredible. You can actually replicate this on your computer. And then about 11 o'clock at night, Cygnus rises perfectly upright, and the bright star Deneb is right in the doorway, the mark of Isis herself. in that particular era. And the whole thing is to basically tell you that your Syrian was to do the place of initiation, where you learn the secret teachings of the mysteries. And the thing that backs that up is the design of the temple and the 17 rooms. Each one of them is one of the ways, the 17 ways that they taught back in Japan in 8000 BC. So you see how all these things are interconnected.
You're just a wealth of knowledge.
I've got nothing better to do.
Yeah, apparently so. What is the link of, there's a big link between Knights Templars, the Divine Feminine, and Portugal, right? Maybe we can.
Oh, yes. Yeah, people keep talking about the Templars and the church and Jesus. The three have no connection whatsoever. They had to pay lip service to the church, otherwise you'd be dead without following the rules and going, oh yes, Father, we're doing this for the glory of God. They just didn't tell them which God they were following. And now the whole purpose of the Templars, and the story really goes back about 50 years before the Templars existed, was a group of people that originally had been in Jerusalem that lost their land and their temples and had to flee for their lives. So 1,000 years later, they were very patiently waiting to go back. And the one thing that the Templar inner brotherhood was very concerned with was the preservation of the ancient mysteries teachings. So there's an outer group and an inner group, and they behave like a ministerial college. They didn't do much fighting. Those are crusaders. Those are different people. The Templars were very much interested in protecting the bloodline of two people, John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene. And you'll know this because every church that they built is dedicated to those two people. There's not one church dedicated to Jesus Christ. Now, that's a big clue right there. And the idea was that, first of all, there was the two pillars of the traditions of the mysteries. One is the priestly Messiah, who basically is the PR. He represents the front of the entire organization. That was the lineage of John the Baptist. And the other one, the most important one, is the one that carries the divine bloodline, which is the tradition that Mary Magdalene was following. So the Templars were essentially maintaining this very old link back into the distant past to maintain the connection between the teachings of the male heritage and also the bloodline of the female heritage. And the two form one entity. And that's why they protected them with their lives. That's why the Templars are very important and why the church wanted to get rid of them, because they wanted to infiltrate the order in order to understand what it is that they were doing in secret. So they didn't understand what they were doing in secret because they weren't allowed in. So they manufactured the story that they were worshiping this devil called Baphomet. Well, yes and no. If you're an Arab person, you'll know that Abu Hilome, which is the original name, means the head of wisdom. And it referred to the mummified head of John the Baptist, which is the only relic that the Templars cared about that was in their possession. So you see how by not being part of the system, you start to conjecture all kinds of wild ideas, and then you kill people because, well, you can't get the information. So the Templars are fascinating, but they're following a very, very old tradition that goes back thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And eventually they create Portugal as a safe place in which to put the Grail, because the Grail is a concept. It's not a physical object. It's a way of being. It's like Maya or Maori. It's a spiritual ideal of the individual. It leads to personal enlightenment. That's what the Grail is really about. But there are people who embody that understanding. So people think, oh, it must be a woman. Well, yes and no. The woman represents that because she is the chalice and she is the carrier of the bloodline, but she is not the Grail in itself. The Grail is an unobtainable, invisible source of information. That's the real gold. And that's why when people did the out-of-body ceremony, at the end of the ceremony, they would come back into the body and they would marry a divine bride, which is Isis, Mary Magdalene, whatever you want to call her, Inanna, and they married their feminine self to their masculine self. They became one entity. That's what they really were preserving. And that's why in Portugal, at a time when Europe was a place of complete barbarity, they found this kingdom as far from Rome as you could possibly get to establish a utopia. And you know what? For almost 100 years, they succeeded. they established this incredible utopia. And if you go to places like Tomada in Portugal, and all the places that the Templars set up, which were on original temples dedicated to Isis, you still feel a sense of connection to everything. There's an elegance about what they did, and you can feel it on the land, just like a stone circle or a standing stone. They were using exactly the same principles. So yeah, Portugal was a very important step into recreating this paradise on earth. And they almost got away with it until the Inquisition showed up.
Mm.
Yes. What would you say has been your greatest discovery?
Mm.
Myself.
That's
No,
a good
really.
one.
I mean, I'm not the same person that I was 30 years ago. All of this is to do with the discovery of the self. I mean, we can talk about information forever, and mathematics and astronomy and stones and, stone circles. Yeah, it's important, but ultimately it's about what these things do to you that's important. And the idea is that you interact with them to discover, A, who you are, two, where you come from, and two, where you're going. The Greeks actually knew about this because at the entrance to their temples that said, know thyself. That's the whole purpose of learning these things and engaging with sacred space, is to discover who you are and your place in the bigger scheme of things. If you can do that, you're really lucky. If you can just do it before you die, you've done a great service to yourself as well and to humanity. And the idea is to come here, remember your purpose in life, apply it. And when you leave physically, when you die, you should leave a little bit better than when you arrive, and you leave the planet in a better place than when you found it. If you can just do that, you've made a huge progress, and you made the best use of your limited time down here on the planet. So that's been my biggest discovery, in the end. And also, of course, I'm being facetious as well, because I mean, I also see a lot of people growing from the work that I've written. I don't try to convince anybody of anything. In fact, I even tell people, I'm not really telling you the truth. I'm telling you facts. You can figure out the truth because that's your truth. My truth is my truth, but the facts, now that's a different thing. The facts don't lie. And I see people changing positively as a result of what I've done, and it makes me feel quite good as well. And I even do this when I go to take people on tours every year, and I watch them on the first day, and they come in with all of their problems from the world. At the end of the week, they're like, swans. They are totally different people, and they go back into the world, and they make changes to their life to adapt. Most of them do, and that's how you make the world a better place. So that, for me, has been the most fulfilling thing. And I have to say, it's not easy. It's not an easy thing, and it's not for everybody. It's hard work. It really is. It's lonely work as well. But that comes with the territory.
It's a journey, yes.
Yeah, that's why we drink heavily.
How many tours a year do you have, and where do you take people?
I was really doing way too much. I was flying 67 times a year, which is,
Wow.
I'm not helping the carbon footprint of the planet. I would rather take a train. I love train travel, but unfortunately, the places I go to, you can't take trains. I used to do Portugal, England, Scotland, Malta, Egypt, Peru, Bolivia, Yucatan, and I think I'm missing another one that I can't remember what it is. And now I'm kind of focusing more on Egypt twice a year. I have so many people on the waiting list that I don't have to advertise. I'll probably die doing this tour of old age, I hope. And I'm planning Portugal right now. I want to go back there.
We're going there for the first time this August. Yes.
Oh, well done. I guarantee you a good time.
After visiting Dr. Sam, we're going to go to Portugal.
It's going to be great. Be careful with the pastry shops. 3 times a day. Oh, you can't get over those.
I know. Elena always pulls me out of there.
Yeah, take an empty stomach. You're going to need it.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to it. But when are you planning to take people to Portugal?
Hopefully next September 2023. I have a secret journey there this September I can't really talk about it, to just plan things and make sure everything's in the right place. I like to do the tour first, make sure that I know what's going on so that people have a good time. And then once that's done, we'll put it out there. I think it's already oversold. Every time I mention, I think I'm going to go back to Portugal and do the tour with the Templars and the megaliths. And everybody puts their hand up and said, well, I can only take 16 people, you know, come on. I don't want to take big groups. Wow, 16 only. Yeah, I do not want to take big groups. It's a balance between expenses, making a living, and making it affordable. But anything more than, say, 22 people for me, it's hard work, because everybody wants to hear what you have to say. You never get to eat a hot meal ever, because they always interrupt you during your meal. And it's like, the food is cold all the time. No matter where I hide, they find me. But I want to keep it personal. You know, I want to feel like it's something that's very, very personal. Again, at the moment, it's a bit difficult because of the cost of fuel. We have to add a few more people to make sure that we don't make the trip so expensive that nobody can afford it. So it has to be realistic. But I want it to be personal. And at one point, I was actually doing tours for just 6 people, with me as the driver, and those were way too much fun, way too much fun. Yeah, because I take people to places where the tourists can't go with a little bus. So big buses over there, little buses over here. And of course, I'm the driver. If I'm not tired, we can be out until 11 o'clock at night. There's nobody in a stone circle at 11 o'clock at night, and we're in Scotland at Callanish, under the stars when it stops raining, meditating in a stone circle. A 10-minute drive to the nearest hotel in the middle of nowhere. Now that's what I call fun, but it's not very cost effective with 6 people, but it was great fun, I have to admit.
Oh, that sounds fabulous.
Now you need only 14.
Why 14?
The 2 of us makes it 16.
See, I know where you're going with this. I think there's 500 people on the list for Portugal already. I'm going to put out the email to everybody at the same time, and in 10 seconds it gets sold. Scotland was like that. I think the record was 16 minutes for Scotland. I mean, it was literally sold in 16 minutes. It was incredible. So yeah, it's getting a bit difficult to go up there. That COVID has not been good for Scotland. It's a local economy. They've suffered quite well, and my whole supply chain is broken up there right now. At some point, I'll get back there because it's a beautiful part of the world. I mean, things have been so well preserved. There are stone circles there that have not changed since the day they were built 5,000 years ago. There are these incredible passage mounds that you can enter, and they're still in perfect states of preservation. Because it was depopulated. The islands were depopulated in about 2500 BC because of climate change. They moved from the islands to the mainland Scotland. So when they left the islands, the peat starts growing around the actual stones. So it begins to cover the stones and protect them. The local people used peat, and they cut it with big sort of blades, and they put it aside to dry, and they use it for heating. So it's like a big lump of turf, and they put it into these heaters, and that's how they get their heat. Well, they used to look at these stones aligned in a circle, and they think, well, it's a nice little group of little stones, until they began to cut away the peat for centuries, and they realized, oh, these are big stones. So the place is beautifully preserved. And because of the lack of tourism, it means that you can go and stand in one of these places, and you can tune in and disappear. And it's been very hard. In fact, there's one particular stone circle in the Isle of Lewis. It's one of my favorites. And not many people go there. I've never seen anyone at this place. I'm almost shy about telling you where it is because I don't want it to change. So Callanish, the most famous one, is over here. And you go 10 minutes drive along the only road south. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. It's just on the other side of the hill. And these tiny little circle of 9 stones, usually filled with water. And it's a place where you literally disappear with the fairies in seconds. I mean, it's like there's no connection, there's no separation between the physical and the invisible in that particular location. And anyone that goes there has exactly the same experience. Not with the other ones. You can have that experience, but this one in particular is very potent. And I thought, why is it about this place? And when I was doing the research for the book, I found that the original name in Gaelic was Shron Achil, which doesn't really mean anything in Gaelic that I could figure out or anybody could figure out. But in Armenian, it actually means the room of seeing. And that's exactly, and this is why I thought, this is why I love old language, because now it tells me why we're having this experience of seeing, we're in a room, a stone circle, and we're seeing into another level of reality. And the local folklore talks about these priests dressed in white robes. They used to go up to the stone circle to have their place where they used to have this sort of priestly thing that they were doing that they didn't tell anybody. Well, yeah, they're having a shamanic moment at this location. So again, the name tells you exactly what was taking place at the stone circle. It's very magical.
You know, I just thought about, because you mentioned the two astrologer friends you had. There's one person who actually brought the ancient Babylonian astrology back into the modern day astrology, and he speaks. He's a mathematician, and he speaks.
Oh, I think I know who it is.
Rumen, right?
Yeah.
You've heard of her. That would be a brilliant connection, I think, for you as well.
Yeah, it's on the side thing of things to do.
Things to do.
Yeah, things happen at the right time. I mean, if I have some spare time, I go into my little my separate hard drive, and there's a whole folder of things by country and by subject. And I think I better tidy this up. I'll do some house cleaning. I'm looking at all of these notes and connections. Thinking, that's kind of interesting. I forgot about that. And before you realize it, they've actually emailed you about something literally within 24 hours. And you think, oh, I was just reading about this note that I made. Here's the guy or the woman that I'm reading about. And you start the conversation, and it opens the door into another project. I don't plan any of this. It just has its own life. And I just sit back and wait and just see until something happens. You know, that's what I like about my work. You don't know where it's going. You have no idea of the end game, which means you can't make up the information as you go. You're following the trail, and sometimes it's a conversation that even today, something will trigger something, and you make a connection with something, and before you realize it, oh, how did I get there? I started this 2 years ago, and here I am somewhere else. It is like a magical interaction. It just shows that there's so much magic in life, isn't there? And we tend to forget about this all the time. We're caught up in all the problems of the daily world. Yeah, they're there. You've got to know what the snakes are doing. That's important, to know what the snakes are up to. But if you can't influence it, don't worry about it. Worry about what you can worry about and focus on that. And then you find there's a lot more positive things going on in the world.
Definitely.
I love that, the way you look at things, because for us, it's also the same thing. You know, we don't ever plan. Things just kind of unfold and surprise us.
It's good fun, isn't it? And it's kind of also the way that the temples were built. I mean, the reason why they were building things in Egypt and then Scotland and then Armenia, I mean, all of these places around the world that have all these incredible temples was to remind you of where you've come from, remind you of the heritage that we've inherited. In fact, the Egyptians wrote a joke on the back of one of the temples. I think it's at Edfu or Dendera. And in one of the crypts, they said, we will continue building temples until people recognize they are the temple. So you can imagine the priest sitting there, you know, going, how are they doing? I don't know. I don't think the people are right yet. Okay, well, let's build another temple and we'll remind them, because that's exactly what happens. So if you go to a stone circle A on Lewis or stone circle B on Orkney, or you go to one of the mounds in Ireland, they're all different. They look very similar, but they're all different. They're all built for different reasons. And if you ask yourself one day, I really need, there's something missing in my life. Now, you've just sent a little packet of information for the universe, okay? That little thought, that little electromagnetic signature goes into the universe to all the sacred sites in the world, and they'll go, hey, I've got the answer for that. And before you realize it, you think, hey, I just feel like going to Scotland. For no reason. I think, how much are the flights? Hey, that's not too bad. I think I'll do that. And before you realize it, you go to one of these places that I've been writing about, and you realize that there you are. You know, the thing that was missing in your life is right there. You feel at home, and you come back thinking, oh, I think I know something else that I didn't know a month ago. And that's how it works. These places were built literally to maintain your connection with the divine. That's the only reason why they really exist. Everything else is to do with earth alignment, it's to do with astronomy, astrology. Those are secondary benefits. The main benefit is to empower the person that interacts with the temple. We're having this conversation before we started about the temple being measured, the energy of the temple being measured. You are alive. The temples are alive. They can be measured. There are methods in various techniques to measure the frequency. One of my favorite ones is at Princeton. There was a group of scientists there about 30 years ago that built a pocket computer that they could take to the sacred sites and measure the frequency of the site relative to the usual frequency that you find everywhere. So right now, I'm surrounded by a light bulb, a computer, a cell phone. All of these frequencies are everywhere. But when you take those away and you compare them to what the frequency is in the temple, there's a big difference between the two. When you add intent or the power of prayer, that frequency goes through the roof. And that's one of the greatest examples that I found in academia. You know, people who are hard-nosed scientists that think that this is all mumbo jumbo from the New Age community, they actually validated what we're talking about. So the temples are alive. They're breathing, living organisms, and they're easily offended as well. So when you go there with all your problems, you're offending the temple, okay? So leave the problems at home. Go into the temple in a place of grace and say, now, why am I here? What is this about? That's all you have to do, and let the temple hit you back with the information, because they go, oh, someone's coming here to pay some respect. And if you give them some flowers, a little bit of water, drop a little whiskey, cheap whiskey, you know, $80 a bottle is very expensive. Yeah, give a little piece of gratitude, because the spirit of place is in the stone. It's in the land. That stuff is still alive. And if you go there with the intent of, you know, offering a little bit of yourself, it's like you're watering a plant. So your intent is watering the temple, and the temple says, well, thank you for thinking of me instead of taking a selfie and going home. What can I do for you? Oh, I see you have a problem with this. Well, let me put this idea into your head. And before you realize it, you're walking around and you go, well, that's an interesting idea. Thank you. I'm so clever. Yeah, the temple just gave you the information, and that's how it works. So it's a real practical magic that we're dealing with here. The fact that it's thousands of years old is inconsequential. Time is not an element here. It's the intent and the integrity of the place that's important, and your interaction with it.
Mm-hmm. It serves like a bridge to all that is. Anyway.
Exactly. And paradoxically, if you understand that as a principle, you don't need a temple. You see, you can embody the teaching. You can go within, as any Buddhist or Zen master will know. You can go within with practice and use your temple and go out. So there's the outer and the inner all the time. You have become the temple, just like the Egyptians have said. You don't need to travel to Egypt. You don't have to go to Scotland, although it's nice. You can just become the temple, and that's it. You already know everything that needs to know, but that also takes practice. There's no shortcuts. Drugs are not going to do it. Ayahuasca is not going to do it. It'll give you an approximation of the experience, but the true wisdom comes from something much finer. And I think Kriya Yoga, from what I understand, is the nearest that you can get to this in the modern era. The way that they actually use the manipulation of the energy field around your body to go inside in order to go out. That's the closest I've seen to the original living resurrection ceremony.
Right.
Good to know.
In the practice of letting go and paying attention to your thoughts, it's also critical, right?
Exactly. Just like the guy behind you or the woman behind you.
Yes. Freddie, it's been such a pleasure. And people can find you on freddysilva.com, correct? Is that?
They can find me at invisibletemple.com.
Invisible. I like that. Invisible.
There's a reason for that name.
And then your brand new book is available on your website.
Absolutely. Yeah, please don't support that very rich billionaire that takes all your money and makes the authors and the musicians totally poor. And I mean that very seriously. Yeah, if you can afford to buy it from direct from the authors or musicians, do it, because it keeps them going, keeps us doing our work. Otherwise, it's you'll get 50 cents for a book that you buy on Amazon. I mean, you can't live on that.
No.
Exactly. So yeah, go and also there's lots of stuff there. Lots of articles and other things that will keep you there for a week. You won't never have to go to television unless you want to watch the documentaries, of course. So
love the documentaries. And where's your latest documentary? Do you also have it on your website?
It's just been released on Vimeo. So that's my carrier. Eventually, about a year from now, it'll probably appear on Gaia. It takes them forever to put this stuff up. But Vimeo is an on-demand service, so you can either rent it or buy the whole thing. and all the other 13 are there as well. So that'll keep you going for a while as well.
Yes, sounds amazing. Thank you so much, Freddie.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Thank you.